There is a version of World War I that most people carry around in their heads without ever examining it too closely. It involves muddy trenches, poets writing about poppies, officers with moustaches, and a tragedy that the world eventually learned from. That version is almost entirely wrong. Not in its details necessarily, but in its emotional architecture. The war that actually happened between 1914 and 1918 was not a tragedy in the literary sense. Tragedies have arcs. They build toward meaning. What happened on the Western Front, and on the Eastern Front, and in the hospitals of northern France, and in the administrative offices of London and Berlin and Paris, was something far more unsettling than tragedy. It was a process, a mechanism, a system that consumed human beings at a rate no one had ever achieved before, and then kept running long after everyone involved understood that it was running. The romantic image of the war exists because it was constructed deliberately, maintained carefully, and protected with censorship that operated at every level of every institution involved. What was suppressed was not dramatic. That is the disturbing part. What was suppressed was the routine. The men who went to war in August of 1914 had no framework for what was about to happen to them. The last major European conflict, the Franco-Prussian War, had lasted less than a year. Wars, in the living memory of anyone old enough to enlist in 1914, were things that happened quickly and then ended. The armies moved. The battles decided something. Peace was signed. Life resumed. This assumption was so deeply embedded in the institutional thinking of every military command in Europe that the plans for the war had all been written around it. The German Schlieffen Plan assumed France could be defeated in 6 weeks. The British Expeditionary Force packed light. The French attacked in their bright red trousers because the doctrine of offensive spirit was still the prevailing philosophy of war in 1914, and offensive spirit did not require camouflage. It required courage. Courage, the generals believed, could overcome firepower. That belief died in the first weeks of August, but it took 4 more years for the institutions that held it to let it go. What replaced it was the trench, and the trench was not a metaphor. It was an engineering solution to a problem no one had anticipated, which was that modern rifles and machine guns made open ground impassable. When soldiers could not advance, they dug. They dug at first for immediate shelter, scraping into the earth with their entrenching tools while bullets passed overhead. Then the scrapes connected. Then the connected scrapes became lines. Then the lines became systems, with support trenches behind the front line and reserve trenches behind those, and communication trenches running between them at angles to prevent enfilade fire, and dugouts cut into the trench walls for sleeping and command, and wire strung across no man's land, and more wire, and yet more wire, until the whole landscape from the Belgian coast to the Swiss border was organized around the logic of men staying underground. By the end of 1914, both sides had built something that neither side knew how to undo. The war of movement that everyone had planned for had become a war of position, and position meant staying. And staying for years in conditions that no military manual had ever addressed produced effects on human beings that no military institution was prepared to acknowledge. The first of those effects was the smell. This sounds trivial. It was not. The smell of the trenches was not simply the smell of mud and unwashed men, though those were part of it. It was the smell of chloride of lime, which was used to disinfect the latrines and which permeated everything near them. It was the smell of cordite from the shells, which never entirely dissipated because the shelling never entirely stopped. It was the smell of rotting wood from the duckboards that lined the trench floor, which rotted because they were always wet. It was the smell of the dead. This last element requires some explanation, because the reality of unrecovered bodies in the trenches is one of those facts that most histories acknowledge briefly and then move past, when in reality it was a defining feature of the environment in which millions of men lived for years. Bodies lay in no man's land because retrieving them under fire was frequently impossible. They lay in collapsed sections of trench, buried under earth thrown up by shells, and sometimes the shells threw them back up again. They lay in the mud beneath the duckboards, where men walked over them daily. The smell became normal. That is the word that matters. Normal. Men wrote home about the mud and the rats and the cold because those were things their families could imagine. They did not write home about the smell because there were no words for it that could cross the gap between the front and the civilian world without causing a kind of rupture that the censors, and often the men themselves, wanted to avoid. The rats were not incidental. They were a significant and constant presence that the historical record tends to treat as atmospheric detail, when in fact they were a practical problem of considerable magnitude. The trenches attracted rats for the same reason they attracted flies. There was food, not just the rations that men kept imperfectly stored, but the bodies. The rats of the Western Front grew large. Men who were there described them as being the size of cats, which is probably an exaggeration born of disgust and darkness. But the accounts are consistent enough that something close to that size is plausible, given the available nutrition. The rats ran over sleeping men at night. They gnawed through kit bags and ration tins. They were trapped and killed in enormous numbers, and the numbers made no difference because the conditions that produced them were never addressed. Men developed a relationship with the rats that was mostly hatred, but occasionally, in the strangeness of long habitation in a terrible place, tipped into something else. There are accounts of men naming individual rats. There are accounts of men feeding them. Not because the men had lost their minds, though some had, but because the rats were alive and present and consistent in a world where almost everything else was arbitrary and lethal. The lice were worse in some respects, because they were more intimate. Trench lice lived on the body. They laid their eggs in the seams of clothing, which is why running a candle flame along the seams became a nightly ritual for men throughout the war. The flame killed the eggs with a series of small popping sounds that men described as satisfying in the way that small, manageable tasks are satisfying in the middle of unmanageable situations. But the eggs were never entirely eliminated because men slept together for warmth and because the delousing stations behind the lines were inadequate to the scale of the problem and because the lice, like everything else in the war, reproduced faster than they could be killed. Lice transmitted trench fever, a disease that caused recurring bouts of high fever, severe pain in the legs and back, and debilitating fatigue. Trench fever was not fatal, which is perhaps why it receives less historical attention than it deserves, but it was responsible for a substantial proportion of the man days lost to illness on both sides. Men who contracted it were ill, recovered, became ill again, recovered again, and returned to the trenches each time because the army needed them. The cycling of illness and recovery and return was itself normalized. It was simply part of what happened. The mud of Flanders, particularly around Ypres, has become, in retrospect, almost a symbol, and like most symbols, it has been abstracted away from its physical reality into something more manageable. The mud of Passchendaele in the autumn of 1917 was not simply unpleasant. It was dangerous in a mechanical sense, in that it could drown men who fell into the shell craters that had filled with water and liquid earth. The shelling that preceded the offensive had destroyed the drainage system of a low-lying reclaimed marsh, and the result was a landscape that was not solid in any useful sense. Men fell off the duckboard paths and drowned. Not every man who fell could be pulled out, because pulling a man out of liquid mud required leverage that was not always available, and because the effort of pulling sometimes dragged the rescuer in as well. Bodies disappeared into the mud and were not recovered. The mud preserved some of them, which meant that in subsequent offensives over the same ground, the shelling occasionally returned them to the surface in a state of partial preservation that was deeply disturbing to the men who encountered them. This happened multiple times across the war, wherever the same ground was contested repeatedly. The landscape was full of the dead in a literal physical sense that the phrase does not adequately convey. The management of the dead was one of the war's great logistical challenges, and it was handled with the same bureaucratic methodology that was applied to every other logistical challenge, which is to say with forms, records, registrations, and a vocabulary designed to maintain administrative distance from the human content of the problem. When a man was killed in the trenches, the ideal outcome was that his body would be recovered, identified and buried in one of the cemeteries that were constructed behind the lines, where a wooden cross would be erected with his name and number and the name of his unit. The ideal was not always achievable. In many cases, the body could not be recovered. In many cases, the body could not be identified because shellfire rendered identification impossible. The phrase "known unto God," which appears on the graves of unidentified soldiers throughout the Commonwealth War, graves cemeteries, was adopted after the war to cover the administrative reality that a significant proportion of the dead could not be accounted for by name. The figure of the missing, men whose bodies were never found or identified, runs into the hundreds of thousands for the British Empire alone. The Thiepval Memorial to the Missing of the Somme carries over 72,000 names. These are not men who died far from their comrades. They are men who died in the presence of their units and simply ceased to exist as recoverable individuals. The sheer number of the missing was itself a product of the industrial scale of the artillery that killed them. The artillery was the defining weapon of the war in a way that is still not fully appreciated. More men were killed by artillery fire than by any other cause. And yet the popular image of the war tends to focus on the machine gun, perhaps because machine guns are more narratively comprehensible. A machine gun is operated by men who choose to fire it. Artillery, particularly the heavy artillery that characterized the war from 1915 onward, felt more like weather. It came from distances so great that the guns firing it were invisible. It arrived without warning, or with only the brief warning of the incoming shell's sound, which was useful only if you knew exactly where to go and had the time and the health to get there. Men who survived prolonged artillery bombardment described a progressive dissolution of their sense of personal agency that is distinct from ordinary fear. Ordinary fear, they said, could be managed by action. There was nothing to do about the shells. You were either hit or you were not. You waited, and the waiting, repeated over months and years, produced changes in the nervous system that were real and measurable and were treated by the military establishment of every belligerent nation as a disciplinary problem rather than a medical one. Shell shock. The term was coined in 1915 by a British medical officer named Charles Myers, who observed in soldiers a cluster of symptoms, including trembling, loss of speech, blindness, paralysis, nightmares, and an inability to function that had no apparent physical cause. Myers initially believed the symptoms were caused by the physical concussion of nearby shell explosions, hence the name. As the war continued and more cases appeared, including cases in men who had not been near any shell explosion, it became clear that the condition was psychological. This clarity created an institutional problem of considerable proportions. If men could become unable to function in combat, not through physical injury, but through prolonged exposure to combat itself, then the war was producing disability at a rate that could not be managed by existing medical categories, because existing medical categories divided wounds into physical and fraudulent. A man who could not walk because a bullet had passed through his leg was a casualty. A man who could not walk because his mind had processed 2 years of industrial warfare was, in the vocabulary of 1915, either malingering or cowardly. The British Army executed over 300 men during the war for offences, including cowardice and desertion. A significant proportion of these men almost certainly suffered from what would now be recognized as severe post-traumatic stress disorder. Their executions were recorded in unit diaries and regimental histories as the enforcement of discipline. Some of those records noted that the men were shot at dawn, which is accurate, and that they died bravely, which was sometimes added as a kind of retroactive grace note to documents that were primarily administrative in character. The treatment of shell shock, when it was finally acknowledged as a medical rather than a disciplinary matter, was itself revealing. The condition was treated differently depending on the rank of the patient. Officers were sent to specialized hospitals in England, where doctors, including W.H.R. Rivers, conducted sessions of what would now be recognizable as early psychotherapy, encouraging men to talk about their experiences rather than suppress them. Other ranks, meaning enlisted men and non-commissioned officers, were treated at forward casualty stations and frequently returned to duty as quickly as possible because the demand for men at the front was constant. The disparity was not secret. It was simply the application of class structure, which organized all of British society in 1914 and applied without modification to the medical management of psychological breakdown. An officer's nerves were worth investing in. An enlisted man's nerves were a resource to be managed and returned to service. The language used in medical records reflected this. Officers were described as suffering from neurasthenia, a term that carried connotations of sensitivity and constitutional refinement. Enlisted men were described more often as having become ineffective or as displaying nervous symptoms, language that preserved the possibility of moral judgment. The food was a constant source of suffering that the official record consistently underplays. The British Army's ration system was designed around a theoretical allocation of calories that was approximately correct for a sedentary man, but significantly inadequate for men performing heavy physical labor in cold, wet conditions while under sustained psychological stress. The theoretical ration included meat, bread, vegetables, tea, and sugar in quantities that looked adequate on paper. What arrived at the front was frequently not what the paper described, because supply chains were imperfect, because transport under shellfire was hazardous, and because the opportunities for pilferage and waste between the supply depot and the trench were numerous. Men in the front line often received cold food in containers that had been carried through mud and were difficult to open. The bread was often stale. The meat, when it was meat and not the tinned bully beef that men came to loathe, was sometimes rotten. The tea was usually available, and tea was important in a way that transcends its nutritional content, because it was hot, and it was something that men could do, the small ritual of making and drinking it in a situation where the range of available actions was extremely narrow. The bully beef deserves its own moment of attention, because it is one of those details that appears in memoirs so consistently that it constitutes something close to a universal experience. Bully beef was canned corned beef, processed and preserved in a way that made it shelf-stable, but also uniformly unappetizing. It was eaten cold in the trenches, scooped from the can with whatever implement was available, often a bayonet or a folded piece of biscuit. The biscuits issued with it were known as hardtack, and they were exactly as unpleasant as that name suggests, dense and durable in a way that made them difficult to chew and nearly impossible to eat quickly, which meant that meals were slow and awkward in conditions where speed and efficiency were generally desirable. Men ate bully beef and hardtack for months. They ate them in the same position, in the same trench, looking at the same stretch of parapet, while the same shells passed overhead. The monotony of the food and the monotony of the environment reinforced each other in a way that contributed to the psychological deterioration that the military refused to formally acknowledge. The water was a separate problem. The trenches flooded. Drainage was poor and became worse with each shell burst that altered the landscape. Men stood in water for days at a time in winter, and the water was not clean. It contained the runoff from the same ground that contained the dead, which meant it contained decomposition products, and it contained the runoff from latrines that were never adequately distanced from the water supply. Trench foot was the predictable result of prolonged immersion of the feet in cold, wet conditions, and trench foot is worth describing in some detail because its consequences were severe. The feet swelled. The skin became white and dead-looking. In advanced cases, the tissue began to break down. In the most severe cases, the tissue died entirely and the foot had to be amputated. The British Army attempted to prevent trench foot by requiring men to rub whale oil into their feet daily, which worked partially, and by rotating men out of the front line more frequently, which worked better. But the rotation system depended on having enough men to rotate, and the casualty rate meant that the Army was never comfortably ahead of its manpower requirements, which meant the rotation schedules were frequently compressed or suspended. The relationship between the front line and time is one of the most consistently reported aspects of the war in the accounts of men who were there, and it is something that the structure of most histories tends to obscure by organizing events chronologically. The men in the trenches did not experience time chronologically. They experienced it as repetition. The daily stand-to at dawn, when every man stood at his position with his rifle ready because dawn was considered the most likely time for an attack, was the same on the 1000th day as on the first. The daily stand-down afterward, when men could eat or sleep or maintain their equipment, was the same. The night patrols into no man's land, crawling through wire and mud to listen for enemy movement, or to cut the enemy's wire, or to bring back a prisoner for interrogation, happened on a regular rotation that made them simultaneously terrifying and tedious. The bombardments that preceded major offensives broke the repetition with an intensity that was overwhelming, but in the intervals between offensives, the war settled back into its rhythm, and the rhythm was relentless and undifferentiated. Men described losing track of months. They described being unable to remember what day it was, not as a disorientation, but as a state that had become comfortable, because the day of the week was irrelevant to the actual content of their days. The letters home were censored. This is known, but its implications are not always fully drawn out. Officers censored the letters of the men in their units, reading each one before it was sent. This meant that men writing home knew their letters were being read by someone they saw every day, which shaped not only what they said about the war, but what they said about everything. It is difficult to write honestly about fear to your mother when your commanding officer is going to read the letter. The censor's guidelines were officially focused on preventing the transmission of militarily useful information, which meant no unit names, no locations, no descriptions of troop movements or casualties. In practice, the censorship operated across a broader range, suppressing descriptions of conditions that might undermine civilian support for the war, and descriptions of the psychological states that the official line maintained did not exist. The letters that survived are therefore a partial record, shaped by self-censorship as much as official censorship, and the gap between what the letters say and what the diaries say, in cases where both exist for the same man, is sometimes striking. The letters are often cheerful, the diaries are often not. The diaries, when they survive, tell a different story. They were technically forbidden because diaries could provide intelligence if captured, but the prohibition was widely ignored because men needed somewhere to put what they could not say in letters. The diaries record the small degradations of trench life with a specificity that letters lack. They record the fear and the boredom and the complicated feelings toward the enemy, who was in many cases also bored and also afraid and also living in a hole in the ground. The famous Christmas truce of 1914, when British and German soldiers met in no man's land to exchange cigarettes and play football, is usually treated as an anomaly, a moment of human warmth breaking through the machinery of war. It was not entirely anomalous. Informal truces at the local level, arrangements between specific units to avoid certain kinds of harassment, were more common throughout the war than the official record acknowledges. Men on both sides arranged without orders to collect their dead during periods when the other side agreed not to fire. They arranged to allow ration parties to cross open ground at predictable times. These arrangements were not pacifism. They were practical accommodations to a situation that men on the ground understood better than the staff officers who planned the offensives. The staff officers are worth considering because the distance between the men in the trenches and the men who planned the battles is one of the defining features of the war's institutional structure. The British General Headquarters was located at Montreuil, a town in northern France that was sufficiently far from the front that the sound of the guns was not audible. The men who worked there lived in requisitioned houses, ate in mess halls where the food was good, and moved through a bureaucratic world in which the war was represented by maps and tables of figures. They visited the front occasionally, in cars protected by escort, and their visits were organized in advance in ways that ensured they saw what could be shown without excessive disruption to the appearance of order. The gap was not simply physical, it was epistemic. The information that flowed from the front to the headquarters passed through multiple layers of reporting, each of which filtered out detail that seemed unlikely to affect the decisions being made and emphasized the progress toward objectives that would justify the decisions already made. The result was that the men who planned the offensive on the Somme in 1916 genuinely believed, on the basis of the information available to them, that the preliminary bombardment of 7 days had destroyed the German defensive positions to a degree that would allow the infantry to walk across no man's land with minimal opposition. The preliminary bombardment had not done this. The German dugouts were deep enough to shelter their occupants from everything but a direct hit, and direct hits from the artillery of 1916 were statistically unlikely given the density of fire and the dimensions of the dugouts. When the bombardment stopped and the infantry went over the top on the 1st of July 1916, the German machine gunners climbed out of their dugouts and opened fire on men walking upright across open ground, and on that single day, the British Army suffered approximately 57,000 casualties, of whom nearly 20,000 were dead. The Battle of the Somme continued for 4.5 months after the 1st of July. This fact is less well known than the casualties of the first day, perhaps because it complicates the narrative. The offensive did not stop when its initial assumptions proved catastrophically wrong. It continued, modified and adjusted but not abandoned, because the logic of attrition had taken hold of the thinking of both sides. Attrition is a military concept that had always existed, but that the Western Front made into a governing philosophy. The idea was simple. The side that ran out of men first would lose. Therefore, killing enemy soldiers faster than they could be replaced was itself a strategic objective, regardless of whether any territorial objective was achieved. The Battle of the Somme was justified in British planning documents partly on the grounds that it would relieve pressure on the French at Verdun, where the German army was applying the same attrition logic in a deliberate attempt to bleed France white. The French at Verdun suffered approximately 300,000 casualties. The Germans suffered a similar number. The British on the Somme suffered over 400,000 casualties. The Germans on the Somme suffered a similar number. The numbers do not resolve into any simple lesson about who was winning, because winning and losing under the logic of attrition are not the same as winning and losing in any ordinary sense. The medical system that processed the casualties was itself a massive industrial operation that has received less historical attention than it deserves. The chain from the front line to the base hospital involved multiple stages. The regimental aid post, which was usually in the trench itself or immediately behind it, where the regimental medical officer provided immediate treatment. The advanced dressing station, further behind the lines. The casualty clearing station, which was where major surgery was performed, and finally the base hospitals, some of which were located in France and some of which were in England. The system was designed to move men rearward as efficiently as possible, treating those who could be quickly returned to duty close to the front and evacuating those who required more extensive treatment. The triage decisions made at the casualty clearing stations were among the most consequential of the war, because the volume of casualties during major offensives regularly exceeded the capacity of the system. Men died waiting to be operated on. Surgeons worked for shifts of 18 and 20 hours during major engagements. The casualty clearing stations during the Battle of the Somme received more wounded men than the system had been designed to handle, and the results were visible in the mortality statistics for wounds that were individually survivable, but became fatal when treatment was delayed. The nature of the wounds themselves was specific to the weapons that caused them, and the wounds that artillery caused were particularly difficult to treat. Shrapnel, the metal fragments produced by exploding shells, created irregular wounds with contaminated edges because the shrapnel carried with it whatever it had passed through, including soil and the material of the man's clothing and equipment. These wounds were highly susceptible to infection, and the particular infection that the soil of Flanders produced was gas gangrene, caused by anaerobic bacteria that thrived in the oxygen-poor environment of deep wound cavities. gas gangrene was fast-moving and frequently fatal, and the treatment was amputation, performed as close to the infection as necessary to get ahead of it. The amputation rates of the First World War were high enough that a substantial population of amputees was visible in every European country after the war ended, and the design of prosthetic limbs became a significant area of medical and engineering development. The men who returned from the war with one arm or one leg or no legs were visible reminders of the physical reality of the conflict, but their visibility was managed by the culture of the post-war period in ways that tended to redirect attention toward their adaptation and resilience, rather than toward the circumstances that had produced their injuries. The gas attacks that began in April of 1915, when the German army released chlorine gas at the Second Battle of Ypres, introduced a new category of weapon and a new category of suffering to a war that was already comprehensively terrible. Chlorine attacked the respiratory system, destroying the tissue of the lungs and causing men to drown in their own fluid as the damaged tissue hemorrhaged. The early gas attacks were partially defeated by the improvised measure of urinating on cloth and holding it over the nose and mouth, which worked because the ammonia in urine neutralized chlorine to some degree. This detail appears in the historical record with a matter-of-factness that reflects the broader pattern of the war, which is that men adapted to conditions that should not have required adaptation and adapted quickly, and the adaptations became normal. Proper gas masks were developed and issued within months, and the ritual of mask drills, the practice of putting on the mask in the minimum possible time, became part of the daily routine. Men carried their masks everywhere, in the canvas satchels that were slung over one shoulder, and the sound of the gas alarm, which was often a length of shell casing struck with a metal rod, became one of the most reliably terrifying sounds in the trench environment. The development of phosgene and mustard gas over the following years extended the range and severity of chemical weapons significantly. Mustard gas, introduced by Germany in 1917, was not immediately fatal in most cases, but was profoundly disabling. It was an oily liquid that vaporized at temperatures above approximately 14 degrees Celsius and settled on the skin, the eyes, and any mucous membrane it contacted. The effects were delayed, appearing hours after exposure, which meant that men frequently did not know they had been exposed until the symptoms began. The symptoms included severe blistering of the skin, inflammation of the eyes, severe enough to cause temporary or permanent blindness, and blistering of the respiratory tract that made breathing painful. Men who were heavily exposed to mustard gas were effectively incapacitated for weeks, and the contamination of the battlefield persisted long after the initial attack, because mustard gas was persistent, remaining active in the soil and vegetation for days. The mustard gas casualties of the First World War included a significant proportion of men who were blinded, and the rehabilitation of blinded veterans became another specialized area of post-war medical and charitable activity, one that required the construction of institutions and support systems that had not previously existed. The psychiatric casualties were handled differently. The men who returned from the war with invisible wounds, with the tremors and the nightmares, and the inability to tolerate loud noises and the disconnection from ordinary civilian life that we would now recognize as the symptoms of severe trauma, entered a post-war world that had no established framework for understanding or treating them. The pension system distinguished between physical and psychological disability in ways that disadvantaged the psychologically injured. A man who had lost his leg received a pension calculated on the degree of physical impairment. A man who could not sleep or work or maintain relationships because of what he had experienced in the trenches had to prove his disability through a process that required him to demonstrate symptoms to boards of medical examiners who were often skeptical. The skepticism was not unusual for the period. The understanding of psychological trauma in 1919 was primitive by any modern standard. But the institutional skepticism was also convenient, because the number of men who returned from the war with significant psychological injury was large enough that full acknowledgement and compensation would have been financially prohibitive. The pensions and the institutions were part of a larger apparatus of commemoration and management that the post-war world constructed around the veterans of the First World War. The cenotaph in London, the Arc de Triomphe in Paris, the war memorials in every town and village in Britain and France and Germany and the other belligerent nations were expressions of grief and honor that also served to consolidate the meaning of the war into a form that was manageable. The war had been terrible. The dead were remembered. The sacrifice had meant something. These propositions were not necessarily wrong in every respect, but they were incomplete in ways that the institutions that promoted them were not interested in examining. The tomb of the unknown warrior, placed in Westminster Abbey in 1920, drew enormous crowds and generated expressions of grief that had clearly been waiting for a suitable occasion. The unknown warrior represented all the unidentified dead, the men lost in the mud of Passchendaele and the shell holes of the Somme, and the ceremony of his burial was an act of collective mourning that was also an act of collective closure. It suggested that the dead had been honored and the war could now be incorporated into history. The war could not be incorporated into history, not in the way that the ceremony implied. The men who had survived it carried it with them in ways that the commemorative framework did not accommodate. The veterans' associations that formed across Europe in the post-war years were not uniformly organized around grief and remembrance. Many of them were organized around anger, around the sense that the men who had fought the war had been misled by the governments that sent them and abandoned by the societies that had cheered their departure. The phrase "lions led by donkeys," which has been contested by historians who point out that the British generals were not uniformly incompetent, nonetheless captures something real about the veterans' experience of the relationship between the men who fought and the men who planned. The planning that sent men into battles that could not achieve their stated objectives, repeated at Loos, the Somme, Arras, Passchendaele, was experienced by the men who survived it as something. The word they used most often in their later accounts was waste, not tragedy. Waste. The fragging that occurred in the French army in 1917 was one of the most dramatic expressions of the limits of institutional control over men who had been pushed past their tolerance. In the spring of 1917, following the catastrophic failure of the Nivelle offensive, which had promised a breakthrough that did not occur and cost the French army enormous casualties in a matter of days, significant portions of the French army effectively refused to conduct further offensive operations. The military called these events mutinies, and some of them were. Men refused orders. Men marched toward the front, bleating like sheep being led to slaughter, a form of protest that was theatrical and specific and clearly organized. The French military's response was to suppress information about the extent of the problem, conduct courts-martial that resulted in death sentences, most of which were commuted, and begin improving the conditions of service in ways that had been requested for years. The mutinies worked, in a narrow sense. The worst conditions were improved. But the event was not acknowledged publicly for decades because its existence complicated the narrative of the war as a shared national effort in which the soldiers had maintained their duty throughout. The German Spring Offensive of 1918, the last major German attempt to win the war before American forces arrived in sufficient numbers to tip the balance, was itself a product of institutional momentum rather than rational calculation. The German High Command understood by late 1917 that the strategic situation was unfavorable. The naval blockade was slowly strangling the German economy. The entry of the United States into the war in April of 1917 meant that the Allies' long-term resource advantage was about to become overwhelming. The Spring Offensive was designed to achieve a decisive breakthrough before this happened, using new tactics developed by the German army involving small groups of infiltrating troops rather than massed frontal assault. The tactics worked, in the sense that the German army achieved the greatest single territorial gains on the Western Front since 1914, advancing in some places 40 miles in a few days. The tactics did not work in the sense that they did not produce a decisive result, because the German army's logistics could not sustain the pace of advance, and because the men who had broken through the Allied lines had advanced past their supply lines into territory where there was food and alcohol, that men who had been on reduced rations for years consumed with an enthusiasm that disrupted their military effectiveness. The offensive stalled. Then the Allied counter-offensive began. Then the German army began to retreat. Then the war ended. The armistice of November 11, 1918, was signed at 5 o'clock in the morning, and it took effect at 11 o'clock on the 11th day of the 11th month, because someone had decided that the symmetry was appropriate. In the 6 hours between the signing and the ceasefire, the war continued to be prosecuted. Artillery fired. Men went over the top. Units advanced on objectives. The casualties in those 6 hours were in the thousands, on both sides, because the orders to continue operations until 11 o'clock had been given and were followed. The men who made those decisions knew the armistice had been signed. The general who ordered an assault on the Belgian town of Mons in the final hour of the war, an assault that resulted in the last Canadian casualties of the conflict, left behind no record of his reasoning that has ever been found entirely satisfactory. The operational logic, if there was one, may have involved securing a strong position before the ceasefire. The human logic, in any ordinary sense, does not resolve cleanly. At 11 o'clock on November 11, 1918, the guns stopped. Men on both sides who had been firing a moment before stood in silence. The silence, after more than 4 years during which the guns had never entirely stopped, was itself a physical experience that veterans described in terms that emphasized its strangeness rather than its relief. Some men wept. Some men were unable to respond in any visible way. Some units cheered. The men in the front lines had been living in the sound of the war for so long that the absence of sound was disorienting rather than immediately comforting. Then they began the process of returning to civilian life, a process for which they had received no preparation and which the societies receiving them had not adequately organized. The demobilization of over 4 million British Empire soldiers and corresponding numbers for every other belligerent nation was itself an enormous logistical operation that was conducted with less foresight than the mobilization that had preceded it. Men were kept in France for months after the armistice, waiting for transport that was insufficient for the numbers requiring it. They were kept in a state of military organization, subject to military discipline, doing very little, in a country that was no longer at war, but had not yet transitioned to peace. The boredom and aimlessness of this period contributed to the unrest that produced the Kinmel Park riot in Wales in 1919. When Canadian soldiers waiting for ships home burned and looted their camp and fought with military police, resulting in 5 deaths and several dozen injuries. The riot was suppressed in the official record for years. It was not compatible with the story that was being constructed about the war and its veterans. The veterans who returned to Britain found a country that had promised them a land fit for heroes and was in the process of discovering that it could not deliver on the promise. The post-war economic depression, the housing shortage, the inadequacy of the pension system, the limited availability of employment for men whose skills were military rather than industrial, produced a veteran's experience of return that was frequently disillusioning. The men who had expected recognition found themselves in competition for jobs that paid less than their pre-war wages. The men who had expected understanding found that the gap between the front and the civilian world, the gap that the censorship had maintained for 4 years, did not close simply because the war had ended. Families had changed. Wives had worked in munitions factories. Children had grown up with absent fathers. The men themselves had changed in ways that they did not have the vocabulary to explain, because the vocabulary for what had happened to them did not yet exist. The influenza pandemic that swept the world in 1918 and 1919 killed more people than the war itself, and its relationship to the war is more intimate than its usual treatment as a separate event suggests. The pandemic spread along military transport routes. It was carried by the movement of troops that the war had produced. The conditions of the Western Front, which had concentrated enormous numbers of men in close proximity in conditions of physical stress and poor nutrition, created a particularly favorable environment for the spread of respiratory disease. The military censorship that had suppressed information about the casualties of the war also suppressed early information about the severity of the epidemic, because epidemic disease among troops was bad for morale, and the war was still ongoing in early 1918 when the second wave began. The pandemic killed somewhere between 50 and 100 million people worldwide, a range that reflects the incompleteness of the statistical record in much of the world outside Europe and North America. The incompleteness of the record is itself a product of the same institutional tendencies that characterized the war. The preference for maintaining narratives of control over acknowledging the scale of catastrophe. The chemical weapons used in the war were not destroyed after it ended. They were stockpiled by every nation that had developed them, and they were used in post-war conflicts in ways that the post-war peace settlements' prohibition on chemical weapons did not prevent. Britain used chemical weapons against Kurdish insurgents in northern Iraq in the early 1920s. The chemical weapons produced during the war left contaminated zones in northern France and Belgium that persist to this day, areas where agricultural land cannot be safely cultivated because the soil still contains unexploded munitions and chemical agent residue. The Zone Rouge, as it was designated in France, encompassing areas of the former Western Front that were considered too contaminated to rehabilitate, was initially far larger than its current boundaries. As remediation technology has improved and as economic pressure to reclaim the land has grown, the Zone Rouge has shrunk, but it has not disappeared. The Earth itself has not finished producing the war's consequences. The unexploded ordnance of the Western Front continues to surface. Belgian and French farmers in the former battle zones bring in hundreds of tons of unexploded shells, grenades, and other munitions every year in what is called the Iron Harvest. Bomb disposal teams operating in the Ypres salient and along the Somme Valley regularly respond to calls about munitions found during agricultural work or construction. Men are occasionally killed. In 2019, a farmer in Belgium was killed when a shell from the First World War exploded while he was plowing. The munitions that killed him had been in the ground for over 100 years, and they had remained functional because the technology that produced them was durable in ways that were not foreseen. The war ended in 1918. The war has not ended. The bones continue to appear as well. Construction projects in northern France and Belgium routinely discover human remains, and the remains are usually military because the ground they are buried in was a battlefield. The remains are examined by forensic specialists attached to various national governments, who attempt to identify them using physical evidence, unit insignia, equipment, and increasingly DNA analysis. Some are identified, many are not. The unidentified remains are reinterred in military cemeteries with the same designation that appears on the graves throughout the Commonwealth War Graves Commission cemeteries, a soldier of the Great War, known unto God. The phrase has a certain dignity in the context of a grave marker. In the context of a forensic examination conducted a century after the death it is recording, it has a different quality. It means that after all available methods have been applied, the individual cannot be distinguished from the mass. The medical consequences of the war extended across generations in ways that the post-war world did not anticipate. The veterans who returned with physical injuries raised families in which the injuries were present as daily facts. The veterans who returned with psychological injuries raised families in which the effects of those injuries were present in ways that the families themselves often did not understand. The study of intergenerational trauma, the transmission of the psychological effects of extreme stress across generations through parenting behavior and potentially through biological mechanisms, was not available to the families of the First World War's veterans. They had to navigate what they were experiencing without a framework for understanding it. The rates of alcoholism among veterans, the rates of domestic violence, the rates of suicide, the rates of what was then called neurasthenia, and what would now be called depression and post-traumatic stress disorder, were elevated in the post-war population in ways that the statistical record captures imperfectly because the connections were not being systematically tracked. The war's effect on religion was another dimension of its consequence that the official commemorative culture managed carefully. The Church of England, the dominant religious institution in Britain, was officially supportive of the war from its beginning. Clergy served as chaplains, services were held in the trenches. The language of sacrifice was religious language, the language of men dying for something beyond themselves. And the war's commemorative culture drew heavily on that language because it made the deaths meaningful in a framework that transcended strategic calculation. The men in the trenches had a more complicated relationship with organized religion than the chaplain's report suggested. The prayers that men said were often private rather than institutional. The sense that God should have intervened and had not was widespread in ways that the official record does not fully capture. The generation of men who fought the war had higher rates of religious skepticism in the post-war period than the generation that preceded them, which is not evidence that the war caused the skepticism in any simple sense, because the broader trend toward secularism was already underway, but which is consistent with the experience of men who had waited for divine intervention and watched it not arrive. The literature of the war that came to define it in the English-speaking world, the poetry of Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon, the prose of Robert Graves and Frederick Manning, appeared mostly in the late 1920s and early 1930s, a decade after the war ended. This delay is significant. The works that produced the dominant literary image of the war were not produced in the immediate aftermath. They were produced after a period of processing, during which the writers attempted to make narrative sense of experiences that had resisted narrative at the time they were happening. Owen's poetry, particularly poems like Dulci et decorum est, achieved their power partly through the specificity of their imagery. The gas attack described from within, the man drowning in his own damaged lungs, the speaker being unable to look away from it. But the power of the imagery in a literary context is different from the power of the reality in a military context. In the literary context, the suffering generates meaning. In the military context, it generated paperwork. The paperwork of the First World War is one of its under-examined dimensions. Every casualty generated multiple documents. The wound was recorded in the battalion war diary, the casualty return, the medical inspection roll, and eventually the pension file if the man survived long enough to claim one. The death was recorded in the war diary, the casualty return, the graves registration document, the effects inventory, the next of kin notification, and the pension application if there was a widow or dependent parent. The documents were maintained by clerks in the various administrative offices behind the lines, men who processed the flow of information about the human cost of the war with the same methodical attention they would have brought to any clerical task. The scale of the administrative operation required to record the casualties of the Somme on its first day, 57,000 men, means that individual clerks on the 1st and 2nd and 3rd of July 1916 were filling out forms for men they had never met at a rate that made individual attention to each case impossible. The forms were filled out correctly. The army was competent administratively. The competence of the administration coexisted with the catastrophe it was recording without apparent tension, because the administration's function was to record, not to evaluate. The officers who signed the letters notifying next of kin of the deaths of their men had, by the middle years of the war, signed so many such letters that the language of the letters became formulaic. Your son died bravely. Your husband died instantly and without suffering. He was a credit to his regiment and to his country. The formulas were not entirely dishonest in that the officers who signed them could rarely know the precise circumstances of each death and chose reassuring language partly out of genuine compassion for the recipients. But the formulas were not entirely honest either, because the actual circumstances of many deaths were not peaceful or instant or free of suffering, and describing them accurately would have been both cruel and useless. The letters arrived in homes across Britain and France and Germany and the other belligerent nations in enormous numbers. In 1916, in the months of the Battle of the Somme, The postman in British towns became a figure of specific dread. His arrival meant the possibility of the telegram, the official notification that arrived before the letter, that began with words that have since become almost cliched in their resonance. "We regret to inform you." The women who received those letters and telegrams did not simply receive news. They received the beginning of an administrative process that required them to navigate pension applications, effects recovery, estate settlement, and, in the case of men whose bodies were missing, the particular kind of grief that is complicated by the absence of remains. The pension process required documentation of the death, documentation of the marriage or dependency, medical documentation if the claim involved disability, and appearances before boards that assessed the degree of entitlement. Women who had lost husbands were assessed on their dependency and their character, and women who were judged to have been inadequately dependent because they had been employed, or inadequately moral because of behavior after the husband's death, could have their pensions reduced or revoked. The administration of grief was itself an institutional operation with its own rules and categories and points of failure. The prisoners of war held by both sides experienced the war differently from the men in the trenches, but not necessarily better. German prisoners held in Britain were generally treated according to the conventions that were supposed to apply, though conditions varied significantly between camps. British prisoners held in Germany initially fared reasonably well, but as the German food supply deteriorated under the naval blockade, the rations available to prisoners deteriorated as well, and by 1917 and 1918, some British prisoners were surviving on genuinely inadequate nutrition. The prisoners who worked in German factories and farms, which was permitted under the rules of war that nominally applied, had access to food through their labor that men in the camps did not. The system of prisoner exchange for severely wounded men, which operated through neutral intermediaries in Switzerland, provided a partial remedy for the worst cases, but it was slow and bureaucratically complex and reached only a fraction of those who might have benefited from it. The colonial troops who served in the British and French armies are perhaps the least adequately commemorated dimension of the war. The Indian Army contributed over 1 million men to the British Empire's war effort. The armies of French West Africa, French North Africa, and the French Caribbean contributed hundreds of thousands of men. The Australian and Canadian and New Zealand armies were crucial to the Allied military effort in ways that their size alone does not explain, because they were consistently deployed in the most demanding sectors of the front. These men were subject to the same conditions as the men recruited from Britain and France, and in some cases to additional hardships related to their different physiological adaptations to climate and their distance from the support networks of home. The Indian soldiers who fought in France in the winter of 1914 and 1915 had been equipped and trained for a different theater and were exposed to the cold and the mud of Flanders without the clothing and footwear that the conditions required. Their letters home, which were written in Urdu and Punjabi and Pashto and other languages and translated by the military censors, reveal both the universality of the trench experience and the particular strangeness of that experience for men from the Punjab or Rajasthan who were fighting in a country they had never heard of before the war began. The experience of the men on the Eastern Front, the war between Germany and Austria-Hungary on one side and Russia on the other, was in some respects more fluid and in some respects more catastrophic than the experience on the Western Front. The distances involved were enormous. The logistics were worse, and the Russian army, the largest army in the world in 1914, was also among the worst equipped and worst led. The Russian casualty figures are uncertain because Russian record-keeping was inadequate, but the military dead alone are estimated at over 1.5 million, with a similar number taken prisoner and several times that number wounded. The Russian soldiers who fought in this war came from an agrarian society in which most of the rank and file were peasants who had no particular understanding of why they were fighting Germany, who spoke in many cases different languages from their officers, and who were issued rifles without always being issued the ammunition to go with them because the Russian munitions industry could not keep pace with the demand. The collapse of the Russian army in 1917, which preceded the political revolution that ended the Tsar's government, and eventually brought the Bolsheviks to power, was not primarily a political event. It was a military event produced by the accumulated effects of years of inadequate supply, incompetent leadership, and catastrophic casualties in a force whose ability to absorb punishment was enormous but not infinite. The Ottoman front, the war in the Middle East and in the Dardanelles, added further dimensions to a conflict that had already exhausted most conventional frameworks for understanding scale. The Gallipoli campaign of 1915, the Allied attempt to seize the Turkish Straits and knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war, resulted in approximately 500,000 casualties on both sides over 8 months of fighting on a peninsula that is roughly the size of Rhode Island. The campaign was conceived as an alternative to the attritional deadlock of the Western Front, a way to achieve a decisive result by attacking in a different direction. It became its own deadlock, with the same features, the same trenches, the same attritional logic, the same institutional inability to acknowledge failure and stop. The evacuation of Gallipoli in December 1915 and January 1916, which was conducted successfully and with minimal casualties, is often described as the best planned and best executed operation of the entire campaign, which is a statement that carries its own weight. The Armenian genocide, which occurred during the First World War, was not the war's creation, but was enabled by the war's chaos and the war's suppression of international oversight. The Ottoman government's decision to deport and systematically kill the Armenian population of Anatolia was carried out using the infrastructure that the war had created: the military organization, the transport system, the communication networks, and the institutional capacity for large-scale movement of populations. The international community that might have intervened was occupied with its own war. The German allies of the Ottoman government received reports of what was happening and suppressed them for diplomatic reasons. The death toll is estimated between 600,000 and 1.5 million people. The event was documented by contemporary witnesses, including German military officers and American diplomatic personnel, and the documents were available in the historical record after the war. The Ottoman successor government, and subsequently the Turkish Republic, denied the events or denied their character as genocide for the remainder of the century and into the next. The war had created the conditions for the event and also the conditions for its suppression. The Paris Peace Conference of 1919, which produced the Treaty of Versailles and the associated treaties that formally ended the war, was conducted over 6 months by representatives of the victorious Allied powers in a city still close enough to the former front lines that some participants could hear, on quiet days, the distant sound of unexploded munitions being detonated by clearance teams. The negotiations were complicated by the number of competing interests among the Allies, by the absence of the defeated powers from the discussions that determined their fate, and by the influence of domestic political pressures on the delegations of each country. The result was a settlement that satisfied few of the parties and created conditions that most informed observers at the time, and essentially all historians since, have identified as contributing significantly to the Second World War. The reparations imposed on Germany, the territorial adjustments that created new minorities and new border disputes, the war guilt clause that assigned sole responsibility for the war to Germany, all of these provisions were not arbitrary. They reflected the political necessities and the genuine moral convictions of the people who drafted them. They also reflected a failure to understand what the war had actually been, as opposed to what the official narratives of the victorious nations said it had been. The war had been, among other things, a demonstration that modern industrial states could sustain military operations at scales and durations that no previous theory of warfare had encompassed. The armies that had entered the war with 6 weeks of supplies and 6-week plans for victory had fought for 4 years and produced casualties in the millions while maintaining their organizational coherence. This was not a failure of modern states. It was a demonstration of their capacity. The same administrative and industrial systems that had produced the machine guns and the shells and the gas and the barbed wire and the military hospitals and the pension offices had also maintained the supply chains, managed the manpower, processed the casualties, and kept the armies in the field, despite everything that the war had thrown at them. The capacity that made this possible did not disappear when the war ended. It was available for subsequent use. The Second World War began 20 years after the first ended, and it killed approximately 3 times as many people, using the same industrial logic at greater scale. The men who had survived the First World War and who were still alive in 1939 watched its successor begin with a variety of responses. Some were not surprised. Some had spent the intervening 20 years saying, publicly and in print, that the peace settlement had made another war likely. Some were surprised despite everything. The veterans who lived long enough encountered something that very few veterans of any war have encountered, which is the beginning of a second comparable war, while their memories of the first were still intact. What they made of this, what they said about it privately and publicly, is part of the record, though not a very well-studied part of it. The record of the First World War, the administrative records and the medical records and the personal letters and diaries and the published memoirs and the regimental histories and the official histories that various governments commissioned and published over the following decades is enormous. It is not complete. The personal experience of the men who were there, the quality of what it was like to be in a trench in winter with the shells falling and the rats running and the smell of the dead in the mud, cannot be fully recovered from any record. It lived in the bodies and minds of the men who were there, and those men are dead. The last surviving combat veteran of the First World War, Claude Schould of the Royal Australian Naval Volunteer Reserve, died in 2011. He was 110 years old. When he died, the living memory of the war died with him, leaving only the records and the cemeteries and the iron harvest and the Zone Rouge and the shells still turning up in Belgian fields and the bones still emerging from the earth of the Somme. The number most often cited for the total military dead of the First World War is approximately 9 million. The civilian dead from the war and its immediate consequences, including famine and the influenza pandemic, bring the total to somewhere between 15 and 22 million. Depending on which estimates are used and which consequences are included. These numbers are cited in almost every general account of the war and have become, through repetition, somewhat anesthetized. They are large enough to be incomprehensible in the way that all very large numbers referring to human deaths are incomprehensible, which is to say that they describe something that cannot be adequately imagined and can only be approached through the accumulation of smaller, more particular facts. A man stood in a trench in France in the winter of 1916 with his feet in water and his rifle fouled with mud and a piece of paper in his pocket that was a letter from his mother that he had read so many times the paper had softened at the folds. He was 22 years old. He had been in France for 11 months. He was not thinking about 9 million dead. He was thinking about when his feet would be dry. He became a number in the 9 million before the war ended, and his mother received a letter in the formulaic language that the army used for such letters, and the letter said he had died bravely, which the officer who signed it could not have known with certainty, and the letter was filed with the other documents in the estate of a man who had very little estate. And the documents were eventually archived, and the archive was catalogued, and the catalogue is accessible today to anyone who knows where to look. The number was always one man. It was always 9 million men. The administrative record does not resolve this into anything simpler than it is.